But I do think there's a responsibility of publishers to find talent wherever talent can be found.
Lounging, son.
Welcome to the Comic Lounge. Today I have another great interview for you guys. I'm interviewing Gene Yang of American-born Chinese fame. He's worked for DC. He is one of the greatest cartoonists of this generation, and it's a huge honor to have you here today.
I appreciate that, Ryan. That's awesome. What a nice intro. Hey, is that your artwork behind you?
No, that's my wife's.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah,
good.
Yeah. I wish it was mine. I'm in her art room. This is the room that she's kind of taken over in the house, but it's the only place I can get some quiet when I record. So
yeah.
So when you came onto the scene with American-born Chinese, you made quite an impression. You won the Prince Award and Eisner, and you were the first graphic novel to be nominated for the National Book Award. Why cartooning? What made you decide to do cartooning?
Yeah, all that stuff that you mentioned, it was really crazy. So American-born Chinese came out in 2006. I'd been doing comics for about 10 years before that, and the kind of support that book got was nuts. It was well beyond anything I could have imagined. I've been doing comics as an adult for 10 years, but I actually began making comics when I was in 5th grade. That was the year that I got my very first comic, the very first issue in my collection. It was a DC Comics Presents starring Superman and the Atomic Knights. And then pretty soon after that, I had this best friend in 5th grade who was also a comic book geek. We started making comics together. So we would sit together at the lunch tables during lunch, and we would write and draw comics, and then we'd get them Xeroxed by his mom, who would take them to work with her and wait till all of our coworkers went home to sneak photocopies for us. Then we take these photocopies and we staple them by hand, and we sold them to our friends for 50 cents each. So the going rate at the time for like a Marvel or DC comic was like 60 cents. We were trying to offer a deal by only charging 50 cents. But that was the beginning. That was the beginning of my comic book career. And you ask why? I think I really like that combination of words and pictures. I love being able to tell stories by drawing.
And who were some of the artistic influences that you had growing up?
When I was a kid, I grew up in the 80s, and back then the American comic book scene is really different from what we have today. Back then it was mostly superhero comics here in America. So Japan had a lot of genre diversity. France also had a lot of genre diversity, like the European scene had all sorts of different kinds of stories. But here in America, the dominant story, the dominant genre was superheroes. So there's some funny animal comics like the Disney Duck comics, and there was some Archie. But when you went to the comic book store, 90% of the stuff that was there was superhero comics. So I was heavily influenced by superhero artists. Even before I knew their names, I was influenced by them. I think everybody working in American comics today is influenced, or at least superhero comics is influenced in some way by Jack Kirby. I think that was true for me. You absorb it even if you don't want to. And I do love Kirby, so it's an awesome thing. But and then I was a teenager during like the Image era, like Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane and all those guys. I was also I was in my late teens when Bone came out. So Jeff Smith's Bone was probably one of the first non-superhero comics that had a prominent place at my local comic book store. So I started collecting that, and I would say he was a huge influence as well.
Awesome. And you're also a teacher. So I was wondering, how difficult is it to balance those two careers?
Yeah, well, now I teach as part of an MFA program. I teach through Hamlin University. Mm-hmm. All my students are adults who want to write for young people. So they want to write like poetry or graphic novels or novels or picture books for young people. Before that, though, I was a high school teacher for 17 years. So for the vast majority of the time that I've been making comics, I was also teaching high school. And for the second half of that career, I was there for 17 years. I was at a high school for 17 years. For the second half of that, I was part-time. We were on block schedule, so I would be at home making comics one day, and then on the next day I'd be on campus teaching. And that was a great balance for me, to be honest. Some of my happiest times are from that period of my life. I feel like
Yeah.
teaching is really extroverted and making comics is super introverted. So it was an awesome balance. But before that, when I was a full-time teacher and also trying to make comics, it was a lot harder.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Are you still teaching during during the COVID thing? Are you doing all online classes, or are you stepping back for right now?
Yeah, that MFA program is what's called a low residency program. So the way it works is at the beginning of every semester, all of the faculty and students gather together. It's out of a Hamlin University, which is in Minnesota.
Mhm.
And we all gather together on the Hamlin campus. We hang out for about 11 days, and then we all go back home. And the vast majority of the teaching happens online.
Oh,
So
okay.
this year, post-COVID, they're just taking that part where we're actually supposed to hang out together, and they're replacing that with a virtual setup. So the whole thing is just online now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And you were named the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. Can you discuss what that entails?
Yeah, that was it was super fun. I mean, that was probably the job title that I had that had the most syllables. It was the fanciest job that I've ever had, and it was a position that was run by the Children's Book Council. That is run by the Children's Book Council, the Library of Congress, and Every Child a Reader. It's not very old. It began in 2008, I believe, and John Cheska, who's this really prominent children's book author, was the very first one. So I was the fifth one, and right now is the term of the seventh one. So his name is Jason Reynolds. He hasn't done any comics. He does mostly novels, but he did do the novelization of the Miles Morales Spider-Man. So if you look for the Miles Morales Spider-Man novel, that's written by him.
All right, cool. And so, there's been a huge increase of, all ages and YA graphic novels, especially distributed through schools. I mean, Raina Telgemeier is a prime example.
Yeah.
Why do you think the all ages stuff and YA stuff has grown so exponentially in such a short time?
Yeah, it's actually really crazy to see. I think, especially, when I was in elementary school in the 80s, in a class of 30 kids, maybe a handful of them would read comics. The vast majority of the kids would not.
Yeah.
They'd read, I don't know, like Babysitter's Club or Hardy Boys, or Encyclopedia Brown was really big at our school. But they wouldn't be reading comics. And now it's crazy. Now you go into a classroom of 30 kids, all 30 of those kids read comics. All of them have most likely read Raina's stuff. The vast majority of them have probably read Bone. It's kind of it's neat to see. It's neat to see. I think there's a whole bunch of different reasons for it. One is we saw this big shift in the comic book market in the early 2000s. Part of that was manga. Like, manga became really popular, and manga is genre diverse, right? Manga is not just one kind of story. So because of that genre diversity, I think it brought a lot of different kinds of readers into the medium of comics. We saw a lot more women and girls. We saw a lot more people who just weren't interested in superheroes find stories that they loved in comic format. And I kind of think that American comics kind of followed that. I think that's one reason. The other reason is like librarians and teachers stopped being as comics averse. They realized that comics actually is a form of reading. And in a lot of ways, especially in reluctant reader settings, comics can be a gateway into the habit of reading. A lot of folks will begin by reading graphic novels, and they'll move on to reading all sorts of books, including graphic novels, but also like prose novels and books with no pictures of them. So I think that's another reason. And then finally, I think that like Marvel and DC, especially Marvel, kind of becoming this giant thing also helped. Like in the 90s, Marvel had declared bankruptcy.
Right.
And now everybody knows who Rocket Raccoon is, which is crazy to me because Rocket Raccoon is like one of the most obscure Marvel characters ever. But I do think that has some bleed over as well.
And do you think that, I mean, just from the time when I was a young kid, because like you said, in the 80s growing up, not a lot of people read comics. Well, there wasn't a lot of people in my classes that really read comics either. That is how I learned how to read. I mean, I got bored of just looking at the pictures. I'm like, I want to know what's going on, you know. So I kind of forced myself to learn, and I was curious with classes and stuff, college courses and stuff, using graphic novels as, you know, literature and courses. Do you think we might see that in like younger grades and stuff? Teachers utilizing these as a way to teach their students?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think that's happening already. Just last year, the Newbery Award was won by a graphic novel called New Kid by Jerry Craft. And that is like the top award in American children's books, right? And before that, there were several graphic novels that had won the Newbery Honor, which is sort of like a runner-up, you know, it's still a really big deal. The first one to do it was called El Defo by C.C. Bell. There's another book that's really, all of these are great books. There's another book called Roller Girl by Victoria Jameson. And because it had that Newbery medal on it, because it had that little sticker, you know, it's a silver sticker or gold sticker, it kind of gave American teachers permission to bring those comics into the classroom. So those comics, all the ones that I just mentioned, they're all targeted at elementary school kids. So there are schools out there that buy class sets of El Def and then just read it as a class. I think that's going to happen more and more as time goes on, and that's super exciting. I mean, like you said, when you were a kid, not a lot of kids read comics, and now they're like doing it as the class, and they're doing like homework assignments about it. It's a totally different world out there right now.
It was cool. I mean, like, even when I took my daughter to, you know, the book fairs they have at schools and stuff, I like went in the room where they had all the books. I'm like, holy crap, like there's comic books, there's like graphic novels here. I was like, where were these when I was a kid? You know, all there was Goosebumps. I mean, not that I didn't like that stuff, you know, I read that also, but it would have been cool, you know, to see that then. But it is cool to see it now. So, you know, in your work, it's pretty evident that, you know, you care about Asian representation. And I was wondering what your opinion is on Asian representation in comics today.
I think there's no question about it that Asian representation and representation in general has gotten way better in American comics than when I was a kid. You know, when I was a kid, I don't know, it was like Shang-Chi, maybe he was the only one. I don't remember a lot. I don't remember a lot of Asian American characters in the books that I was reading. You know, and that wasn't just comics. It was like everything. It was like television, movies, everything. And now it's a different world. Now I think, especially within the last 5 or 10 years, representation just has gotten much better. Part of that, I think, is especially in superheroes. I kind of think that superheroes are they're like a deeply American genre. You know, they were invented in America. They kind of came of age as America was coming onto the world stage as a superpower. So there are a lot of parallels between the superhero genre and America's history. In a lot of ways, I think superheroes at their best really express something about America at our best. So when there's this push for there to be diverse superheroes, I kind of think that it's, in some ways, it's like a push, like we kind of want to see anybody can be an American, regardless of your cultural background or anything else. Anybody can be American, right? So I think it's great. I don't think we're there yet. Like, even within Asian representation, it's better, but I still don't think I don't think we're seeing a full picture of all of the stories that can and should be told about Asian Americans, and especially, you know, within the Asian American community. I think Pacific Islanders and Southeast Asians, there's just not a lot of that. You know, there's not a lot of their stories that are out there. One exception, just recently, there's a great Green Lantern book called Green Lantern Legacy as part of the Young Readers line.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's written by Min Lei and it's drawn by Andy Tong. It's about a young Vietnamese American boy, and I think that's like the beginning of something. So I'm excited to see that.
Awesome. And what do you think about non-Asian writers writing about the Asian experience or Asian characters? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I think there are two separate issues actually at play. One is the writer, right? Like I know how hard it is to write. I know how hard it is to write. It is like facing that blank page or facing the blank, Microsoft Word screen is super terrifying. Like whenever I'm doing it, whenever I'm just starting off a script, there's something inside of me that wants me to do anything else. Like I would rather do dishes, than start a script. Or I'd rather go like, rearrange my Lego minifig collection, anything, go make the bed, anything, go vacuum, right? Because it's just terrifying. So I'm really reluctant to put more barriers in front of my fellow writers. I kind of think, that anybody ought to be able to write a story about any kind of character. But if the story is, if the character is not reflective of your own background, then you just have a ton of homework in front of you. I think you have to approach it with respect, which means you have to approach it by being willing to do the homework, by being willing to do the research, by being willing to talk to people, who have an insider's view of that. And you also have to go in with a certain amount of humility. When I'm teaching in an MFA program, that's what I tell my students. If they want to write something about somebody who's not the same as them, I tell them go in with humility and a willingness to do your homework. So that's on the writer side. On the other side, I think part of the current conversation right now is that there are not enough stories published by authors and creators of color. That's changing, of course. I think that's changing, yes. But I think that's definitely true. And I'm reluctant to put the burden of that on the writer, because I'm a writer. I feel a lot of sympathy for writers. I know the terror of that blank page. I don't want to put any more burden on them. But I do think there's a responsibility of publishers to find talent wherever talent can be found. So I definitely would want to see more of that. I would want to see way more creators of all different backgrounds telling stories.
Right. So you think, is that what you think is probably the issue then, is that there's just not enough diversity in creators that are writing for the publishers?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I also think, historically, there's just some really crazy things, right? Like Wonder Woman did not get a woman writer until like the 80s. She came out in like the early 1940s. It took 40 years for them to find a woman writer. That's kind of nuts. So there's stuff like that. Right? Or Black Panther. Black Panther debuted in the 1960s. I don't think they got a black writer on him until the early 2000s. So I think there are cases like that where it's just so egregious, because I think it's obvious that if you are writing like a woman character, a woman writer doesn't have to do as much homework because her life is homework. Yeah. So it just seems like when you read about those stories, I get why people were mad about that. I feel like it's like, as a lifelong comic book fan, that feels a little bit shameful that it took that long for them to find a woman writer for Wonder Woman.
Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't know that. I'm a huge proponent for, like, I'd rather see an all-female creative team on Wonder Woman, because I feel like you're going to get a more genuine story or experience from them, as opposed to a man writing a woman. It's just not to say that men can't write great female characters. I think Greg Rucka is a huge example to me. He writes great female characters, but still, you can't capture the genuine feelings of a woman unless you are a woman. I think, and I think the same goes with everything else. And like you said, I think there is a lot more representation, like books like Bitterroot, Excellence. Those are two of my favorite titles right now. I do think that there still needs to be more diversity in comics. I think it's time for the new guard to kind of like make their way into the industry, kind of, you know what I mean? Like, kind of like start breaking away from some of these old ideas a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. I 100% agree. And I also think that, that goes for genre as well. I just think comics need diversity in every sense of that word, right? And for people in the industry to hold the door open for younger folks to come in, I think that's super important.
Yeah, and speaking of diversity in stories, much like American Born Chinese, which I'm ashamed to say I just read that for the first time the other
Well,
day.
thanks for reading it. I appreciate that.
Of course. I mean, I read Dragon Hoops, and that seemed like a very personal project to you. And
Yeah.
I was wondering, why was that particular story so important for you to tell?
Yeah, Dragon Hoops, I feel like was a story that found me. So it's a graphic. I have it here. It's a graphic novel about basketball. You can tell from the cover.
I love it.
I didn't design the cover at all. It was designed.
Whoever designed it, they did a great job.
Yeah, Kirk. He's amazing. He even got the texture right. But it's my first nonfiction graphic novel, and I really feel like it was a story that found me that kind of demanded to be told. So I did not grow up playing basketball or watching basketball. I was not a basketball fan before starting the story. On that campus where I used to teach, there was an amazing basketball team. You know, they had an amazing basketball program. And during the 2014-2015 season, everybody on campus was talking about the varsity men's team. That was like the biggest story on campus. And at some point, I just felt like I had to figure out what was happening. So I started talking to the head coach, a PE teacher named Coach Lou Ritchie. He and I became friends. And as I got to know him, as I got to know this team, I discovered this really intense story that I felt like, even though I don't know anything about basketball, I have to put this down on paper. You know, I have to do a graphic novel about it. So that's what this is. It ended up, originally when I proposed it, it was supposed to be 200 pages long. It ended up being 440 pages. It was supposed to take me 2 years to do, and it took me 5. It was way more complex than I thought it was going to be.
I mean, I loved the book. It came out at probably the perfect time for me. I read it right after Kobe's passing, and I'm a huge basketball fan. I watched it with my dad as a kid. So, when Kobe passed, it kind of resurfaced some feelings I had when my dad passed, and then here's Dragon Hoops, and it kind of got me out of my head for a second. I read it in one sitting. I couldn't put the book down. I loved it.
That's awesome to hear.
Yeah, and I was wondering what that experience was like for you. I mean, you said you didn't really follow basketball, or you weren't like a huge basketball fan. What was that experience like following this team so closely? And what experiences from that time really resonates with you today?
Well, can I ask, were you a Lakers fan?
Well, I was a Bulls fan when I was like 4. That's when I started watching it. But yes, I was a Lakers fan. I mean, from the minute Kobe was a part of the team, I was watching Lakers. So
yeah.
I watched the whole career.
Yeah. I mean, I think Kobe is one of the folks that really demonstrates the power of sports. Because I was not a basketball fan, but I of course knew about Kobe, but I didn't just know about Kobe. I also knew what his personality was like. I don't think I'd ever seen, like, while he was in the prime of his career, I don't think I ever watched a full game. I saw highlights every now and then, but I don't think I ever watched a full game. But I still knew what was in and out of character for him, the way like a comic book fan would know what is in and out of character for like Batman, So it points to how powerful sports can be. Following that team was a ton of fun. It was way more fun than I thought it was going to be. So it was a nationally ranked team. We got to travel all over the country. Coach Lou was kind enough to get me plane tickets and in like hotel rooms and stuff, so I could watch the team play at all these different tournaments. We went to Missouri. We played against Ben Simmons in Florida. That was like a televised game on ESPN, and it was great. I think during that season, I got to know not just the coaches and the players, but also the sport itself. So I was reading a lot of books about basketball history, and I got really fascinated. It's like, it's kind of I kind of think that, like, as a sport, it was an underdog sport. When it was invented, the big sports in America were football and baseball. And for basketball now to be considered on the same level as football and baseball, I don't think people would have predicted that in the early 1900s, So just the fact that it's risen so quickly and so far is stunning. In terms of what I learned during that season that still stays with me. I was struck, because I was never an athlete when I was a kid. I was struck by the amount of courage these kids had. What I realized is that in sports, you're not guaranteed to win. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like a superhero comic where you're guaranteed that the superhero is going to win. You're not guaranteed to win. And I think that uncertainty can be terrifying, especially at that age. Those kids, they knew when they stepped out on that court, they would be making memories that would be with them for the rest of their lives. Like when they were 70-year-old men, they're going to look back on that season and remember moments as clear as if they happened yesterday. And some of those memories would be good ones, but there were also going to be ones that would be embarrassing, that would be bad memories, So those are really high stakes for a teenage kid. But even despite that, they were willing to step out onto that court and give it their all. So as I followed that team, as I got to know the players, I began to understand that mentality and those stakes. And I think I just came away with this admiration, and also this realization that kind of courage. I think you just gotta have that in all different areas of life. Not just sports.
Yeah, I mean, the entire book. I felt like I knew each member of the team because you broke it down. I loved how you had the alternating chapters. You showed the history, which, I mean, I know a lot about basketball, but I didn't know some of the stuff you talked, especially the women's basketball. I thought that was really interesting. And each student, how each, because high school can be tough, and you really had such a amazing grasp how each of these students was feeling at that particular time. Have you talked to them since? Have they seen the book? Have you gotten any feedback?
Yeah. I actually just was on a Zoom with them. So the current team had their season cut short,
Right.
Of course, just like everybody else. And it was sad. They were actually doing really well. They were on their way to the state championship. I think they were 2 games away from the state championship. And then as an end of the year celebration, Coach Liu invited the 2014-2015 team to kind of give a pep talk, and he also invited me to join in the Zoom. So I saw them all. They're all adults now. I've kept in touch with a couple of them since that season. So I've kept in touch specifically with Arinze, whose sister Odera was a McDonald's All-American, and then Jeevan Sandhu, who is the Sikh kid. Well, he's not a kid anymore. He's an adult. He just got into med school. He's like, but he was a kid. He was a kid in the book, and it's really awesome to see. The more I get to know Coach Liu and that program, the more I really believe in it. The more I see that, he takes it to heart. Basketball is not just basketball. For Coach Liu, basketball is a way of teaching life skills. And as you watch these kids become adults, as you watch them get into their 20s and 30s, you can really see that. You can see how they take these lessons that they learned on the court and they apply it. They apply it to their real lives. Like Isaiah Thomas, who is one of the kids in the book. With a name like that, he had to play basketball, right?
Yeah.
but he just this last year, he became the first person in his family to graduate from college. He is now applying for graduate school. All of that would not have happened had he not been on Liu's team. I'm sure he would say that. All of that would not have happened had he not been on Liu's team.
Yeah, I think, as somebody who doesn't play sports, I mean, I love basketball, but I'm a comic book nerd. I don't really, I don't go out there and play basketball, but like you talk about applying these life skills to everyday life, sports metaphors or whatever you want us to call them, like Kobe's Mamba Mentality book. It's about basketball, but if you read between the lines, like he's giving you lessons on how to be in life, how to like attack life, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting that you got that aspect across in the book as well. And I just love that book so much. Now I wanted to talk about Shang-Chi. That was supposed to come out. I think it was probably supposed to drop this month, but now it's coming out in September.
Yeah.
And you're wrapping up Terrifics at DC.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those 2 books real quick.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Terrifics was super fun to do. I did issues 15 through 30, I think, and I just turned in 30. I just turned in 30. So it was a team that was created by Jeff Lemire. I'm a huge Jeff Lemire fan. He kind of made like a DC version of the Fantastic Four. Mm-hmm. But I'm gonna be honest, I think the Terrifics are cooler than the Fantastic Four because like it's got Plastic Man. It's awesome.
Yeah.
It was part of the Age of Heroes initiative in DC at DC Comics. It's the only one that lasted all the way to issue 30. I had a ton of fun doing it. I was a fan of the book before I became a writer. So he had the same editor on that book that was editing me when I was writing New Superman for DC Comics. Mm-hmm. So his name is Paul Kaminsky. Paul knew that I was a fan of Jeff Lemire, which is why he offered the book to me after Jeff left. But really, I thought of that book as I thought it was about the future. You know, I think Fantastic Four is about the future from the perspective of the space age. And then I think that the Terrifics are about the future from the perspective of the information age. I think you can see some of that in Jeff's stories. Mm-hmm. And then I really try to lean in on that when I took over the book. But it was fun. It was a ton of fun to do. You know, I'm gonna miss that book for sure. The other project that I just started, I am working on issue 3 right now. Like today, like before I got on with you, that's what I was working on. Is Shang-Chi, and originally, like you said, it was supposed to come out this summer, but now it's been pushed back because of COVID. But Shang-Chi has been a lot of fun to work on as well. I was not a Shang-Chi fan when I was a kid, but he is the most prominent Asian American hero out there right now. So to get to work on that has been great.
So what are you bringing to Shang-Chi that we've never seen before? How are you approaching this?
Yeah, it came out of a discussion. It definitely wasn't just my idea, but we want to explore. We want to make him more three-dimensional, first of all. So he had a really weird origin story, right? It had lots of rough elements to it. This is what I heard about how Shang-Chi got created. Marvel Comics wanted to get the Bruce Lee license, you know, but they were unable to do it. This was during the 1970s, during the Bruce Lee craze. So they're like, what other prominent Chinese character can we get? Oh, Fu Manchu's up. So they got the Fu Manchu license, and then they created this original character, Shang-Chi, who was Fu Manchu's son. They lost the Fu Manchu license, or they gave it up, but they still had Shang-Chi. So what they had to do after that was they had to kind of rejigger his origin story to take all references of Fu Manchu out. But at the same time, it's not like DC, where, you know, DC has had a couple of really hard resets, but Marvel hasn't, right? Mm-hmm. Marvel hasn't had this like hard reboot of their universe. So that stuff is still in play. What we want to do is we want to take all of that kind of stuff and make it more three-dimensional. Like I did some reading up on Fu Manchu. In a lot of ways, I think he functions like a ghost in a ghost story. You know, so the way a ghost functions in a ghost story is they represent the reader's fears or the viewer's fears of getting punished for past sins. I think a lot of ghost stories function like that. And I really think Fu Manchu, when he came out, he was like this villain who was bent on taking over the Western world. He was created by a British writer. And I think in a lot of ways, it was this British writer working out his guilt over the Opium Wars and over like the Boxer Rebellion, you know? So there's like this Chinese figure that kind of wants to get revenge on Britain and on the Western world because of all these things that had happened in the past. In the comics, I don't know if that aspect had been explored up until this point, but we're going to be talking about it. And then the other thing for Shang-Chi himself, we want to kind of fill him out by giving him a stronger supporting cast. So we're actually introducing a bunch of siblings that are going to be a part of his life.
Oh, awesome. I'm very excited to check that out. Are there any other projects that you're working on? Anything that you're writing and illustrating?
Yeah, right now I'm in kind of a weird stage. You know, I just finished Dragon Hoops, which took me a long time, and I also just finished Superman Smashes the Klan for DC Comics. That
Oh
also
yeah, that's right. I
to do.
forgot to talk about that.
Oh,
Talk about that in a second.
You are so thorough about everything else. So, but so I'm in this spot where I'm like throwing out proposals and I'm seeing what's going to stick. That's where I am right now. I've been working on a bunch of different proposals. So we'll see what lands, and hopefully something soon will, and we'll be able to move forward.
Okay. Well, thank you for correcting me. So let's talk about Superman Smashes the Klan. I love that book. Myself and my manager at the shop both agree it's probably one of the best Superman stories that's been written in years. I absolutely loved it, from the writing, the art. The story was great from the old Superman radio show.
That's right.
I was wondering if you could kind of talk about how much of yourself you put into that book, because I know that some of the themes, like we talked about earlier, it's not just about Superman. So I was wondering if you could talk about why you chose that project and how you injected some of yourself into that story.
Yeah. I've been fascinated. Like you said, it's from an old radio show, from the Superman radio show. I was always fascinated with it. I first learned about it by reading Freakonomics, that New York Times bestseller, is a nonfiction book about, like, it's written by this economist and this reporter, and they take the economist's view on all these different things, and they see what comes up. And one of the things they talk about is this old radio show storyline where Superman fights the Klan, and it had this real world effect. It had this effect of dropping the membership of the actual real life Klan. So they were talking about how, like, stories and media can really have this really intense effect, and as a comic book geek, I'd always been criticized by my immigrant parents that these stories that I was reading about these guys in tights had nothing to do with the real world. And here was a concrete example of how that just wasn't true, how geek culture actually is important, how it actually can affect the world in these really profound ways, right? So after I finished New Superman with DC Comics, I had this talk with Bob Harris and Marie Javins. Marie ended up being the editor of the book. We talked about what I should do next for them, and I proposed doing an adaptation of the story, because it's never been adapted to comics before. They said yes. I was kind of shocked by that. I actually think, the reason I really wanted to do it, there are two things. One was there's a bunch of stuff that was happening on the news that I just found really horrifying. Charlottesville was one. The other was the shooting at the African American church. And I remember reading about that on the news and thinking, I grew up in the 80s. I read about church burnings and those sorts of things happening in the 60s in my history textbook. So it felt like the things that I was reading about in my history textbook when I was a kid in the 80s were actually happening again, like in 2014, 2015, 2016. It was just really disconcerting. It felt like we were moving backwards. And then, so that was one reason I wanted to do it, and the other reason was I actually was having this talk with an acquaintance. So we were drinking some wine. It might have been the wine talking, and we were talking about America. I don't even know why that came up. We're talking about America and being Americans and what it all means, and how, like, the world kind of feels like it's kind of fracturing in all these really crazy ways. And then sometime during that talk, I was like, so I have 4 kids with my wife, and then he had some kids, and I was like, how do we not know that our grandkids are not going to be the same people, or our great grandkids are not going to be the same people? Like even you and me, like how do we know that our grandkids, or our great grandkids, or our great great grandkids are not going to be the same people? So in a really concrete way, we might be linked. Like, we might be linked by the future. And even if that actually doesn't happen, even if that connection doesn't happen, our futures are tied together. Like, they're becoming more and more tied together because of technology, because of the way communication goes, because of the way technology goes. Our tomorrows are become, like, they're the same. You know what I mean? Like, we're all tied together. So I was like that just, I felt like I had to put that idea in the story, and it ended up being Superman Smashes the Klan.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, like, stuff you read in the textbooks and it's happening again. It's disconcerting for me as well. You know, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I would like her ideally to grow up in a world where we aren't living in such a fractured country, and it starts at the top, man. You know, and it's just trickling down through our country, and I'm hoping that all these protests that have been going on, to me, I mean, maybe this is hopeful thinking, but I feel like maybe we are going to see a change. Maybe something different will come out of this. I mean, I'm hopeful. I know that this has been going on for years, you know, protesting against this kind of stuff. I can't pretend to understand how others are feeling directly, but I do know that this has been long overdue. The changes, what's happening in this country between the police stuff and the racism. It's time for a change, you know?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Yeah, yeah. I think you gotta hope. I think we gotta figure this out, or I mean, I think it's gonna be apocalyptic if we don't figure this out. You know what I mean? Like,
it feels that way.
Like very soon, we gotta figure this out. You know, we gotta
look at Seattle.
Treat people with justice, or it's gonna be, I don't know.
Yeah. So as a teacher, you're helping guide the future generations. What is the best advice that you give your students?
In terms of just life,
anything, any advice that you impart on your students. I mean, I've gotten stuff from teachers in high school that have stayed with me to this day. In a class I didn't even sign up for, African American history, but he talked about more than just African American history. He talked about current events, and I learned so much from that man that I will never forget the stuff that he imparted on me. So I was wondering what kind of stuff you impart on your students.
Yeah, well, I you know, from that season following that basketball team, I learned that you sometimes just have to step out into situations that make you uncomfortable. You know, that's the only way to grow. And then with my own kids, my biological kids right now, I think I tell them that they're not defined by their failures, you know, or their successes. That they're defined by something else, something deeper. That they're defined by relationships, you know. So to invest as much or more in their relationships as they do in what the world sees as success and failure.
Awesome. And a couple more things. One, what books or creators are you currently following right now?
Yeah, I've been reading some Mariko Tamaki. We're friends, but she's also one of my favorites comic book creators. I just last night I read the first issue of Far Sector. I know I'm a little behind on that, but that was a great book. Yeah, it's a great book. It's a great book. I really like Mark Russell. I think he's awesome. Billionaire Island, I think, is hilarious. I think all of this stuff is really funny, but it's like funny and also profound. Like Wonder Twins is awesome. Bitterroot, you mentioned, I think is great. In terms of non-comic stuff, I recently finished a book called Not So Pure and Simple. It's a YA novel, but the two of the main characters are comic book geeks. So if you're a comic book person, you'll recognize all the titles that they're reading. Okay. It's really fun. It's really fun stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. And then lastly, where can all the listeners find you online? Where's the best place to find you?
I'm at my name. So Gene Luen Yang, all one word. That's my website, geneluenyang.com. And I'm also at that handle on Twitter and on Instagram.
All right, cool. And once again, thank you so much for being here today. It was a huge honor, man.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Thanks for having me. This was super fun.